morning and welcome to another FasTrax webinar. This is a weekly event we do every Friday at 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern, where we go over various topics of the FasTrax software. You can see a list of these events if you go to our website, choose the FTX Lifeline tab. Once this loads, scroll down just a bit and look for the webinar button. Choose that. And this next page will show a list of all of our webinars that you can register for, as well as a list of all of our previous webinars where you can view the recording. And you also have the option of signing up for the newsletter by choosing this subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about vendor parts and vendor part kits in retail. And these have had quite the number of changes over the past couple years. Simply put, what a vendor part is a unique item number that's tied to a UPC that is identified to the vendor as that item number. Vendors don't always use the UPC as their order number. They generally use some kind of anywhere from 4 to 7-digit unique identifier that could be alphanumeric, could be numeric, could be purely alphabetic. That's whenever you're ordering in the system, you're going to be ordering against vendor parts. The system will analyze your UPC sales and then look for vendor parts that are tied to those UPCs associated to that vendor. So let's go into Directory and let's take a look at this. All right, so I'm going to go to my price book module and I'm going to look up an item here real fast and we're going to look at the vendor part associated with that. All right, here we go. So I've got a camel pack here. I looked up the camel pack, noticed that there's no vendor part tied to it. Yet when I choose the purchase unit and I go to the carton, there is a vendor part. That's because if you're going to be utilizing links, as in purchase unit, subunits, parent childs, and your items, you always want the parent item, the purchase unit, to contain that vendor part. You should always have the top level of an item be the vendor part container. If you have vendor parts associated to the child item, the pack, that could cause ordering issues. So make sure that you always have any vendor part associated with the parent or purchase unit. In this case, you can see on the carton, I have one vendor part. Now, if I want to add a vendor part to this item, I can simply do that from the item details page or the vendor parts page. We're going to do the item details page first. So I'll choose the add part. Then I have an option here of choosing what vendor this is for. Notice that the part number is automatically going to be defaulting to the UPC. Now I can change that, and more than likely I probably would, simply because, like I said at the beginning, vendor parts are generally going to be different than your UPC number. So let's say that I want to change this to ABC123. That would be altering that vendor part number. It's not saved yet because I haven't chosen the save part. Let's say I want to go to a different vendor. I want to have this associated to a different vendor. Let's say here, ABC123. The number of units is going to be how many total UPCs this UPC here is contained whenever I receive this vendor part, this new vendor part that I'm creating into the price book after I do an invoice. So in this particular scenario, carton is generally going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. Whenever I receive one vendor part, I'm going to be receiving one carton. And then I have my cost. What does it cost to receive that product? And I'll save that. This will save the vendor part. Notice I now have a new vendor part there. And then I also want to save the item itself. So I'm really pressing two different saves. The save part hyperlink after I build the vendor part, and then the save button on the item itself to save that item that will generate my queue records, and then I can send that queue record to the applicable stores that's associated with that vendor and this item. So that's how you add a part. Now, there's a couple rules when it comes to vendor parts. You generally always want to have only one vendor part per item per vendor. So for example, vendor 39 here, I have a vendor part here. In this scenario, that's Cormark. I don't want to have another vendor part associated to this item under vendor 39. That would be a problem because if I did an automatic order for Core-Mark and this item was indeed going to be on that order, it would put both vendor parts on that order. At that point, you could potentially, if you're not paying close attention, order twice as many as you actually need. So make sure that's just a good rule of thumb to, if you're going to have multiple vendor parts, make sure that they're not to the same vendor. Those vendor IDs should always be different. Now, another rule would be the vendor part number itself. Whenever I am building vendor parts, I don't want to ever reuse this 117341 vendor part for Core-Mark for another item. That would pose a problem. So make sure that the vendor part numbers themselves are always unique to the vendor. You can have as many vendor parts as you need on an item, as long as one, the vendor part is going to be one per vendor, and then two, that vendor part that's on that vendor isn't used anywhere else for any other item on that same vendor. Those are the really only two rules you have to follow when it comes to vendor parts. Now, we looked at one that was a 1-to-1 ratio. Basically, if I'm receiving one vendor, if I'm ordering one vendor part, I'm going to be receiving one of this UPC. There's going to be scenarios where you could potentially have no purchase unit. You're really selling just a subunit. And that could be an example of like candy. So just real quick, I'm going to make an item here. And we'll just call this Snickers. And this is going to be a box of 24 candy bars. So I'll put my category here. And I'm just going to say they're $1 a pop. I'm selling them for $1.50. And I'm going to save that. Now, in some situations, I may put the purchase unit, the box itself of 24. But I don't want to do that in this scenario because I'm probably not going to sell that box of 24. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make this item, I'm selling the individual unit, the candy bar itself, but the order number, the vendor part itself, I'm going to put at a different number of units. So I've built my item, I've saved it. That's the first process. Now I'm able to add my vendor part. One thing you don't want to do is when you're building your item, add your vendor part before you actually hit that save button. That would cause a problem because whenever you're building this item, if you haven't saved it yet, when you choose this hyperlink to add part, you're technically not building a vendor part for the item you're trying to create because that item doesn't exist yet. There's an order of operations. So make sure when you're building a brand new item and attaching a vendor part to it, you build the item first, choose save, then you can build the vendor part. So I'm going to choose the vendor part here. I'm going to say this is from Core-Mark. Just give this a long vendor part number. Now, in this scenario, whenever I receive this box of candy bars in, I want it to be the actual candy bar itself, not the entire box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 24 here. And then the cost is going to be $24. I'll save that part and I'll save that item now. Now what this does is whenever I receive this vendor part on an invoice, instead of receiving one box of 24 at $24, it's going to be receiving 24 of this UPC, that candy bar itself, and dividing that cost by 24, which gets me to my $1 cost. That's how vendor parts with multiple number of units work. So you can do it both ways. You can have a vendor part that's associated to your purchase unit when there's a purchase unit subunit relationship, or you can build an item that's really just the subunit itself, no purchase units in the price book at all, and then associate that vendor part to that item with a quantity that's greater than 1. Okay, so that's how you build vendor parts on the item details page. Now, there's more options available for vendor parts whenever you go to the vendor parts tab at the top. So I'm going to go to my vendor 39 here, and we're going to take a look at some of these. So when I'm building a vendor part here on this page, I have quite a number of extra options. There's your add new button, there's your save, print, and delete, just like everywhere else. Here is going to be your vendor dropdown. The next area over is going to be the part number itself. So that vendor part number that we used here. You have a part description. Now this is where there starts being some differences. On this screen, I can actually have my vendor part description be something different than the UPC description itself. Whenever I create a vendor part on the item details page, the vendor part description is always going to be equal to the item description. Whenever I create a vendor part here, I can actually differentiate that. I can have a different part description than my UPC description. Below that's going to be my cost. A unit description, that's going to be an optional field. That could be a unit of measure designation, such as pack or carton. We'll go over these checkboxes here in just a moment. There is the UPC that this item is assigned to. If I don't know that UPC, I can use the find hyperlink and find that UPC by UPC description or vendor part. There's my UPC description, which is a non-editable field because I'm not in my item details screen. And then there is the number of sellable UPCs in the part. Now, looking at a couple differences here, you have the min order quantity and the do not order and manual order checkboxes. Now, the min order quantity, what this field does, it does not exist on the item details page. This means that if this item is on an order, this vendor part, I have a minimum order quantity that I have to hit. So if that's 0, it follows no rules at all. There is no minimum order quantity. So that's going to, I can order 1, I can order 100. It doesn't really matter. If I have the minimum order quantity set to any value greater than 0, let's say I have 5 here, if this item fits the criteria for an order, I can't just order 1 of it. The system's going to make me order, in this case, 5. I have to hit a minimum order quantity, so it's going to make me order 5. The next checkbox is the do not order. This, simply put, is going to be like an inactive checkbox that's on the item, but for a vendor part. What this does is if you have this set to true, checked, then this item cannot be ordered. You cannot, even if the item fits the criteria for an order method, you cannot order that item. You can't also put that item on an order manually. It just does not let you do that. That's a good way to discontinue vendor parts. The next checkbox is going to be manual order. What this does is, if this is set to true, checked, anytime you do an order and this item fits the ordering method criteria, as in the filter, it's always going to place this item on the order, but it's going to place that on the order at a 0 order quantity. Even if the system thinks that you should order 50 of this, it's going to be on that order at a 0 order quantity. If the system thinks you shouldn't order it at all because you have plenty on hand right now, it's still going to be on that order because it's set to a manual order. And that, like I said, it's always going to be a 0 order quantity. Okay, so that covers the differences on this screen rather than the item details option. Now, when it comes to manipulating these checkboxes, there's a mass change option down here. So to utilize this mass change, I actually have to highlight items, and then I can use the mass change button and it will follow the criteria set by this dropdown. So for example, let's say in this price book zone, I've got 2 price book zones, zone 0 and zone 1. Let's say that I want this to be set to do not order. Let's say that I want to set this back to, let's go to this item instead, because I've actually changed the others. So if I go to my secondary price book zone here, and I look at these, they're identical. No checkboxes are chosen. Now, if I want to change just price book zone 0 to do not order, I can highlight these items. I can choose this checkbox, apply to all zones. I can set that to false, unchecked. And then I can set the do not order option to true, and then mass change. I'll get prompted, or am I sure I want to do this? I'll choose yes. Then on this zone, those items are set to do not order. On zone 1, those items are still set where they can be ordered. So price book zones basically contain a price record for your items, but they also contain a vendor part, a unique vendor part per zone. So if I have some stores in one zone and some stores in another zone, I can discontinue, I can mark some vendor parts as do not order or manual order for just that zone and it not affect other zones. Now, if I want it to affect all zones, then I can choose that checkbox, apply to all zones, and then use this drop down in that button. That's perfectly fine. By default, that's actually turned on because whenever I make a change, it's going to affect all zones. In general, that's the case what you want to happen. But if you did need to do just one zone at a time and have that differentiating options on each zone, then you can do that. Okay, so that covers the vendor parts in this area. Now there's one thing we want to look at in mass updates, and that will be masquerading vendor parts based on the UPC. So if your vendor really doesn't utilize actual vendor part numbers, they use UPCs, there's a quick way to make vendor parts for those items. In mass updates, if you filter to a certain number of items, let's say I want to build items for vendor parts for these items here, I'll filter to those particular items. And then under my utilities here at the very bottom, I have the option for vendor parts. What this does is on this filtered items in that grid there, I can choose the vendor that I'd like to create vendor parts for. And then I can choose add. And what it does is I'm going to get a prompt here to want to add parts for this selected item. What it does is when I go to this item now, I'm going to have a vendor part for that particular vendor that's equal to the UPC. That's just a quick way to build vendor parts for items that may not have vendor parts, and you need quick vendor parts in place for those for ordering purposes. Now, it's always going to be equal to the UPC, so if your vendor actually utilizes unique vendor part numbers, this isn't the way to go about doing that. Okay, so that covers the mass updates tool of mass building vendor parts. Now let's take a look at vendor part kits. Now a vendor part, as we've seen, is going to be a one UPC, one unique UPC to one vendor part number ratio. When I go to my vendor part kits here, when I choose one, notice there's multiple UPCs. That's the main difference. A vendor part kit is going to be multiple UPCs that's associated to one vendor part number. So I can have more than one UPC in this particular vendor part whenever I receive it. An example of usage for that would be if you're getting a display from your vendor. A lot of times that display you receive will have multiple products on it, but it's tied to one unique UPC. So if we look at this here, whenever I receive this particular product into inventory, that 487, I'm going to be receiving not just one, but two different UPC products. There's the number of units that's going to be received for each UPC, and then there's the piece cost. That UPC in this part is going to be equal to 23.69 cents, essentially. The vendor part kit cost is going to be a sum of the UPCs contained within that kit. So there's my summed price. That's going to be the main difference between a vendor part kit and a vendor part. Now I have the option here to do not order. A lot of times that's going to be the case. If you're receiving a kit, you're going to be receiving like a display. You can't actually reorder that display. So you'd probably just want to mark each vendor part kit as a do not order because you wouldn't want that to try to order or an automated ordering method. Okay, so that covers vendor parts and vendor part kits and retail. I hope everybody learned something new today. Once again, you can go to our website, goftx.com, choose the FTX Lifeline tab at the top of the page, scroll down just a bit and look for that webinar button. Choose that, and then this will show you a list of all of our webinars that occur every Friday at 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern. You can sign up for these events by choosing the Register Now button. You can view the recordings of all of our previous events by choosing the View Recording button, and sign up for the newsletter that lets you be aware of upcoming FasTrax news and upcoming webinars. If you have any questions on this topic, let us know at websupport@FasTraxPOS.com. And if you have any suggestions for future webinar topics, let us know at info@goftx.com. Thank you, and have a great weekend.